Hey class, welcome again to Intro to Cultural Anthropology. It's our second little video. Most of the time you'll be getting just one longer video at the beginning of class, but since the first one was mainly about the, I'm going to turn this off so you can see me better. There we go. The first one was mainly about the syllabus. I thought I would wait and get into the content more thoroughly today. So today we're going to talk just a little bit about what is anthropology. Starting with, why are we here? We are here to study anthropology together, and anthropology is the study of human species and its immediate ancestors. Anthropology, unlike other ways of looking at the world, looks at the whole picture of what it means to be human. We look at things from a holistic point of view, which means we don't study just one aspect, like how we think about something, or how our economic status affects something, or how our political system affects something. We would look at all of those variations and how they work to shape culture. Anthropology also looks at the ways that we learn what it means to be human and what it means to be part of our communities. A lot of the things that we think of as biological or normal or expected behavior are cultural, which means that not only are they learned, but they vary between communities and over time. We learn about things in two different ways. One is enculturation. We learn growing up in our families from our friends and our parents and our schools and our churches what is the sort of behavior that is expected of someone living in our culture. We also learn through acculturation, which is when we come into contact with another group of folks. Whoa! And we learn their ways, and that becomes part of how we see the world. So you could think of this class as a process of acculturation, where we will learn more about the ways that other people live around the world, and much more about what we think we know about our own culture. Anthropology looks at adaptation, variation, and change. How do we adapt to the world around us, both over time through genetics and through change and adaptation through culture? Mostly what we're going to talk about here in cultural anthropology. How do we, for instance, learn to deal with the environment that we live in? Our textbook talks about how folks adapt to high altitudes, and they point out that there's a number of ways that that happens, right? One of them is through technology, which is a specifically cultural way of adapting to the world, right? We've decided how to make machinery that makes it easier for people to get along in their physical bodies when they're in high altitudes. There's also biological ways that we've adapted to high altitudes, both long-term and short-term. One is, genetically speaking, things in our bodies that change, that make us more able to function in high altitudes, are things that we are more likely to pass on to our offspring, right? So we can both change in our bodies through like lung capacity getting bigger because we need to use more of that, but also through things that make us better able to survive in our environment are going to be passed on to our offspring and then be more common in the ongoing population. So genetics has a piece of it, but there's also culture. You may have noticed when you were registering for classes that you had the option between cultural anthropology, which is where you are, and general anthropology. That's because anthropology is actually what we call a four-field discipline. There's four different aspects of how we look at human beings. They work together in a lot of ways. Often projects have folks from all of the different disciplines working on them together. Lots of folks call this general anthropology. It's also called four-field anthropology, which is a little funny because we talk a great deal now about applied anthropology, which is a fifth field. So one is sociocultural or cultural anthropology. That's what we're looking at today, how living human beings live together in groups. There's also archaeology, which often if I tell people I'm an anthropologist, they're like, oh, like Indiana Jones. No, Indiana Jones was an archaeologist. Archaeologists dig up the material remains of cultures in the past and then learn what we can about the way they live together from the stuff they left behind. There's also biological anthropologists who look at the ways that our bodies adapt and change over time, like we were talking about in the previous example, and linguistic anthropologists who look at the ways that language changes between groups. When anthropology first started in the US, it started a little different than it did in other countries around the world. Mostly that's because anthropologists here were studying a rapidly declining population of the original settlers of this land. Since they were working with Native American communities, they looked at all sorts of different parts of that, right? Their material culture, their ways that their languages, many of which were dying out, their customs, their history. And so anthropology became a field that took all of those pieces and put it together to try to get a fuller picture. At the same time, in Europe, each of these fields was developing sort of more on its own, right? Archaeology over there is part of a humanistic tradition, part of history, and cultural anthropology is its own separate field, but not here. So, the topic of our class, cultural anthropology, which describes, interprets, and explains social and cultural similarities and differences, and tries to help us understand one another through that. Anthropology's job is not necessarily to judge other people, even though in a lot of ways that's our natural impulse, right? We think that what we learned growing up is the way the world should be. Anthropology makes you stop every time you say, that's normal, or that's weird. What do I really know about that? We learn that through two different ways of conducting research. One is ethnography, where an individual anthropologist goes and lives with their people. Anthropologists are terribly nosy. They want to hang out with you and learn everything about the way that you move through the world, through interviews, through watching, through doing what you're doing. We call that process participant observation, and it is the main methodological tool for anthropologists. So and then they write a book about it. Ethnography actually means writing about culture, right? So anthropologists fundamentally are writers, and we're going to be doing some of that work as we move along in this class. That's why you have a number of writing assignments, because anthropologists observe the world around them and they write about it. There's also ethnology, which is a comparative cross-cultural study of ethnographic data, right? So you could look at research that 3 different researchers had done in very different parts of the world. Each of them had written about the economic details of their culture's life, and then an ethnology would compare those 3 and try to make up great theoretical conclusions about what we know about the ways that people use money and resources based on the common or uncommon practices between these 3 groups. Trying to get this video done in the period of time allowed on YouTube, so I'm going a little fast. Then there's archaeology, again going back to our Indiana Jones example, right? Archaeologists are looking at how human beings lived together in the past, and they get there by digging up the stuff or finding the stuff that we've left behind. So you might think, what sort of material culture would you leave behind? What do you throw out in the trash? What does that say about what's important to you? For instance, what is all this technology we're going to leave behind when we're not here anymore? What is that going to say about what is important to us as a people? We also have biological anthropology and its many varied parts, studying human evolution, human genetics, human growth and development, human biological plasticity. I love this one. We think that our genes are a map for what we're going to be like, right? But culture has a lot to do with that too, right? We set out with this set of genes, but you can take 2 babies, twins, with the exact same genetic material, so they'd have to be identical twins, and raise them in 2 different cultural groups where they were fed different, where they were had different amounts of physical exercise, where different things about their body were judged to be important or not important, and they could grow up to look very dissimilar, right? How tall you are, for instance, has a lot to do with how you're fed as a kid, not just the genes that you have. We have linguistic anthropology, which studies language and its social and cultural context through space and time. It looks not only at what languages did we have in the past and what can we learn about people from that, but also it looks at sociolinguistics, which shows how communities are related by the ways that their language changes when they come in contact with one another. And finally, applied anthropology, which we talk about as the fifth field, but that actually takes anthropological knowledge and applies it to a social problem. For instance, if one were striving to understand and solve the problem of anorexia, part of that problem is medical, right? But part of it is totally social and cultural, right? How do we value thinness? How are young girls taught the way that their body is supposed to look? How do we glorify a certain expectation of female body type? It'd be really hard to come to concrete conclusions about that unless you were looking at that piece of the information as well. Anthropology, thus, shares a lot of source material with the other social sciences, but it goes at it in different ways. For instance, sociology, which is our closest relative, often studies more industrial societies, like our own, whereas anthropology historically has mostly studied small indigenous cultures, although that is less the case now because of the different fields they started out in. They use really different tools. We also steal tools from each other, but sociology is often very interested in survey data, things like census material. They look at a lot of statistical things. They use sampling. If 4 or 5 people out of this group of 10 do this thing, then that thing is probably really common in that group. Whereas anthropology seeks to be on the ground, actually observing what people do. Psychology, right, looks at the ways our brains work and how that connects to the world, but those patterns are based on cultural factors, right? So there's lots of things in, for instance, the DSM of talking about mental disorders that are very culturally bound, and you might find different ways of thinking about the ways people's brain work and the way they think based on, again, what's important in their culture. So we end up with this question of, is anthropology really a science or is it humanities? It's hard to say, and you're going to get a different answer depending on who you talk to. We are definitely classified in the social sciences, and that's because we do participate in the scientific method, right? We want to make some hypotheses around the world, test them, have them be repeatable, come up with theories of what that tells us, and then test those theories. But anthropologists are also fundamentally interested in interpreting and analyzing the world. We sort of believe that the scientific method is not the end-all and be-all of knowledge about the world. For instance, we talk about the hard sciences, right? And we think of the hard sciences as being very clear-cut, totally fact-based, not bound by culture at all. But the things that an individual scientist chooses to research, what's important to them, what speaks to them, and how they approach it is shaped by their view of the world, is sort of fundamentally shaped by culture. So we think that science isn't the only way of viewing the world. The field itself, like its research, is holistic, both qualitative, or interested in facts and numbers, and quantitative, descriptive, I did that backward, and qualitative, which is descriptive and analytical. You need both of those pieces to really come up with a clear picture of what our world looks like. So, for next week, I want to be sure that you know that you've posted in the forums, both for our discussion this week and to acknowledge the late policy and other policies in this class. I want to remind you that if you want to discuss grades with me by email, you have to send me that FERPA form that's in week 1 in our classroom. For next week, you're going to read Chapter 2 in Katak and Spradley and McCurdy, pages 13 through 19, Eating Christmas in the Kalahari. And I can't wait to talk with all of you again. Goodbye.